The toy store was alive with laughter and excitement. Parents carried shopping bags, children tugged at sleeves, pointing at glittering displays of dolls, action figures, and racing cars. Bright lights shimmered off wrapping paper, and holiday music played in the background. But in the middle of that noise stood a little boy, thin, in worn shoes and a hand-me-down jacket. His name was Samuel. He wasn't looking at the toys. He wasn't reaching out like the other children. Instead, his eyes fixed on a man standing at the counter, watching fathers pick out gifts for their kids. When a cheerful clerk knelt and asked, "What do you want for Christmas, sweetheart?" "A car." "A robot." Samuel shook his head slowly. His voice cracked as he whispered, loud enough for the stranger nearby to hear, "I don't want toys. I just want a dad." The words silenced everything around him. The clerk froze. Parents glanced uncomfortably. But the stranger, a man in his 40s, dressed neatly, standing just a few feet away, didn't look away. His jaw tightened, his eyes burned with a memory he couldn't bury. And in that moment, a story began that no one in that toy store would ever forget. If this moved you already, stay with us. What happens next will touch your heart in ways you didn't see coming. And if you love stories that touch the heart and soul, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the ones still to come. Samuel lived in a small foster home at the edge of town, a place that smelled faintly of old paint and tired carpets. The building was filled with noise, children shouting, crying, laughing. But Samuel often sat in the quiet corner of his bunk, watching, waiting. Other kids talked about birthdays and Christmas mornings filled with gifts. But Samuel had learned not to hope for those things. For him, holidays meant one thing: sitting on the edge of his bed, pretending he didn't care when no one came to visit. His world was made up of second-hand clothes, meals that barely filled him, and bedtime stories he told himself because no one tucked him in. Yet despite all this, Samuel wasn't bitter. What he wanted wasn't something you could buy. Every night, he pressed his small face against the cold window and whispered the same prayer, "Please, God, send me someone who won't leave." That was Samuel's greatest wish. Not a toy, not a game, just a hand to hold, a voice to tell him he mattered, a father who wouldn't walk away. And it was this longing, this aching emptiness, that spilled out of him in that toy store when he whispered those haunting words, "I just want a dad." What Samuel didn't know was that his words had pierced someone else's heart, a stranger carrying wounds of his own, who was about to change everything. The stranger stood frozen for a moment after hearing Samuel's words. The bustle of the store carried on around them, but to him, everything had gone silent. He knew that ache, the ache of a child crying out for someone to stay. Slowly, he stepped forward. "Hey, buddy," the man said gently, kneeling so he was at Samuel's eye level. "What's your name?" Samuel hesitated. He wasn't used to adults asking with kindness. His voice was soft, almost guarded. "Samuel." The man smiled faintly. "That's a strong name. I'm David." The clerk glanced nervously, unsure whether to interrupt, but David's focus never wavered from Samuel. "You know," he continued, "when I was your age, I thought toys would fix everything too. But sometimes what we really need isn't something you can put in a box." Samuel's eyes widened, curious, as if he sensed David understood him in a way others didn't. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp bill. "How about we grab you a warm meal first?" he asked softly. Samuel blinked, his small fingers trembling. "You mean, with you?" David nodded. "With me." But before Samuel could answer, another voice cut in. A foster home worker, rushing over, grabbed Samuel's arm. "Come on, Samuel. Don't bother people." Samuel's face fell instantly, the fragile spark in his eyes flickering out. David stood too, his jaw tightening. And in that moment, he had to make a choice. Step back into silence, or step forward into a boy's life in a way that could never be undone. David's chest tightened as he watched the worker tug Samuel away, his little shoulders slumping like the weight of the world pressed down on them. He couldn't look away. He remembered being that boy, unheard, unseen, treated like a burden instead of a child. "Wait," David said firmly, stepping forward. His voice carried authority, the kind that made people stop. The worker turned, startled. "I'd like to talk with him, if that's all right." The worker frowned. "He's under our care. He doesn't need strangers filling his head with false promises." But Samuel looked up at David, hope flickering faintly in his eyes. "Please," he whispered. That one word broke something in David. He knew he couldn't walk away. David reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, placing it firmly in the worker's hand. "My name is David Lawson. I'm not just a stranger. I run Lawson Enterprises." A hush fell over the nearby parents and clerks. The worker's expression faltered. "If I say I want to buy this boy lunch, I mean it. And I don't make promises I can't keep." Samuel's lips parted, stunned. Someone was actually standing up for him. But before the worker could reply, Samuel's stomach growled loudly in the silence. Embarrassed, the boy ducked his head. David's voice softened. "Let me feed him. Just one meal. Then you can decide what happens next." The worker hesitated, but finally released Samuel's hand. Moments later, the two of them sat in a quiet corner of the cafe across the street. Samuel stared wide-eyed at the plate of warm food in front of him, as though afraid it might disappear. He took a bite, then another, his small hands shaking with hunger and disbelief. David watched, his chest tightening. This wasn't charity. It was a reflection of a boy he once was. "Samuel," he said gently, "what you said back there, about wanting a dad, has no one ever told you that you deserve one?" Samuel paused, tears welling. No one ever stayed long enough to say it. David clenched his jaw, his heart pounding. He wanted to say more, to tell Samuel something that had been buried for years. But the words caught in his throat. Because if he says them, his whole hidden truth would come spilling out. Samuel's words hung in the air like a knife twisting into David's chest. No one ever stayed long enough to say it. David inhaled deeply, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. He had hidden this part of himself for so long. But looking into Samuel's eyes, eyes that mirrored the same loneliness he once carried, he knew the time had come. "Samuel," he said quietly, leaning forward, "there's something you don't know about me." The boy looked up, crumbs clinging to his lips, curiosity flickering through his sadness. David reached into his wallet and pulled out an old, creased photograph. He laid it gently on the table. It showed a boy about Samuel's age, standing outside a foster home in ragged clothes, his face hollow but his eyes alive with yearning. Samuel blinked, confusion and disbelief chasing across his face. "But you're rich. You're important." David smiled faintly, though his eyes glistened. "Now, yes. But back then, I was the kid no one wanted. I spent birthdays alone. I sat in corners while other kids were picked up by families. I told myself I didn't need anyone, but every night, I whispered the same prayer you just did. Please, God, give me a dad." Samuel's breath caught. The room seemed to shrink around them, the clinking of dishes and chatter fading into silence. David's voice grew steadier as he continued. "One day, a stranger walked into my life. He didn't have much, but he gave me something no toy ever could. His time, his love, his belief that I mattered. That one act saved me. And it's the reason I'm here today." Samuel's small hand hovered over the photograph, trembling. "So, you know what it feels like?" David nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "I know it better than anyone. And that's why I couldn't walk away when I heard you. Because when you said those words, Samuel, I heard the voice of the boy I used to be." Tears spilled down Samuel's cheeks as he clutched the photo to his chest. His next words came out as a whisper. "Does that mean, maybe someone could want me too?" David leaned forward, his voice firm but tender. "Not maybe, Samuel. Absolutely. And tonight, that someone is me. The boy froze, his eyes wide with shock, because for the first time in his life, someone wasn't just giving him leftovers of kindness. Someone was offering him a place in their heart. Samuel stared at David in stunned silence, his tiny fingers gripping the edge of the table. For a boy who had lived most of his life expecting to be left behind, words like, "that someone is me," sounded too good to be true. David smiled gently, sensing his hesitation. "You don't have to believe me right now," he said softly. "But you will. Because I'm not walking away." He reached across the table and held out his hand. For a moment, Samuel just looked at it, the hand of a man who could have easily ignored him like everyone else. Slowly, cautiously, he placed his small hand into David's. It was the first time in a long time Samuel had felt warmth that wasn't from a blanket. It was human, steady, safe. Later that night, the two of them stood outside the foster home. The social worker met them at the door, puzzled. "Mr. Lawson, are you sure about this? It's Christmas Eve. Most people don't." David interrupted gently. "I'm not most people. Not anymore." He handed her a folder, neatly filled with documents. "I've already begun the process. I want to foster him first. Then, when everything's right, I want to adopt him." The woman blinked, shocked. "You've only known him for a few hours." David nodded. "I've known his story my whole life." Inside, Samuel's bag was small, just a change of clothes and a few broken toys. But when he walked out to David's car and saw the blanket folded neatly in the back seat, his heart felt heavy in a new way. Not with sadness, but with something like belonging. As they drove through the glowing city streets, Samuel looked out the window, eyes wide at the twinkling lights. "Are you really taking me home?" he asked, voice trembling. David glanced over, smiling. "Yes, Samuel. Home." The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Do I get to call you something?" David's hand tightened on the steering wheel, his throat thick with emotion. "You can call me whatever you want." Samuel looked down, thinking for a moment, then said softly, "Dad." The word filled the car like a prayer answered. David's eyes stung, a tear sliding down his cheek as he whispered back, "I was waiting to hear that my whole life." The camera would linger here, the man and the boy driving into the night, past shimmering Christmas lights and falling snow. Two hearts once broken, now finding healing in each other. Sometimes, the family you dream of doesn't come from where you expect, but from the stranger who refuses to walk past your pain. And that's the real miracle of love, not found in gifts or grand gestures, but in the quiet promise, "I won't leave." If Samuel's story touched your heart, remember, there are countless children, countless people, still waiting for someone to see them. And sometimes, the love we think we'll never find arrives when we least expect it. Don't let this be the last story you carry with you tonight. Subscribe now to SoulTwist Stories, and keep watching, because the next story in this playlist will move you even deeper than this one. Stay with us. The journey has only just begun.